And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud host of Beyond the Budget 2025, where they are reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Good evening. Welcome to the program. I was wondering if you have any idea how much water your household actually uses. Have you put that down to rands and cents? And I was reminded today of how little I knew about electricity and how much electricity my home was using before load shedding started. I mean, in those days, of course, I didn't have children. I was just married. Now, once halfway through high school, that tells you how long load shedding's been going. The point I'm trying to get to with all of this is that there's a very interesting question around how to manage our water more effectively simply by knowing how much of it we're using, when, where, and how. And I wonder if that's going to be one of the things we'll see now. In other words, electricity metering suddenly became a big business because electricity became so much more expensive. If, for example, in Gauteng, and despite the promises by the Gauteng Premier Panyaza Lesufi last night, I suspect that water is going to get more expensive because it's just difficult to get it to you. And that means that maybe we'll start to take the metering of water a little more seriously. By the way, in case you're wondering, we get our water from the Vaal Dam, which is supplied by the Sterkfontein Dam as part of the Vaal Dam river system, which goes all the way back to Lesotho and the Lesotho Highlands Water Project. The Sterkfontein Dam, about the same size as the Vaal Dam, stayed at 98% capacity for the last couple of months really. The Vaal Dam this time last week, 63%. Would you like to know the impact of the rain of the last week? 84% is where the Vaal Dam is right now. And that's not just rain, of course, falling in the sort of Joburg, Gauteng area. It's rain in what's called the catchment. But still, extraordinary to go from 63% to 84%. I wonder if we'll open sluice gates by the end of all of this. We'll talk about the B20 in just a moment. So much to ask. They're obviously the Business 20 meetings, trying to set the agenda, I think, for the G20. Very interesting and slightly difficult time for business, of course. Everyone watching the White House and the Trump administration very, very closely. But also, and I keep saying this, maybe an opportunity for South Africa to sort of be a counterpoint to Trump, to stand up for multilateralism, to stand up, if you like, for rules-based global trade. Might, for various reasons, be almost uniquely placed to do that. And then I see just in the last hour or so, Old Mutual announcing that Nomkhita Mqweni will now be the chair of Old Mutual Bank. Interesting to see how that is moving on. Old Mutual Bank, we know, of course, coming on. You've heard their CEO on The Money Show. How much water are you using? Do you know? 011 883 0702 021 446 0567 and voice notes this evening on 072 702 1702.
The Money Show
With Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
and DSTV channel 856.
We start, of course, in Cape Town tonight where the Business 20, the group that links businesses or business with G20 governments, has been meeting. That's as part of the G20 meetings that are underway this week, including the meeting of finance ministers and central bank governors. Mxolisi Mgojo is the co-chair of the Business 20. Mxolisi, good evening to you and thank you for your time. We know the themes.
Good evening, Stephen.
We know the themes for this year's G20 are solidarity, equality, and sustainability. Is that what you focused on in today's meeting, or are there other issues that are crowding those out a little bit?
Well, thank you very much for the invite to your listeners. Yes, we have a theme which really is supporting and augments the government's G20 theme, and our theme is inclusive growth and prosperity through global collaboration. And so really when you think about the G20 themes, it really supports and complements that theme. So ours is really looking at those number of policies which by and large, a lot of them are very much coming from the past B20s, which look at various issues that global business leaders have had to be dealing with on a continuous basis. And these themes really coming out of those and the task forces that are being put together that are going to address and also deliberate on policies around various of these within these task forces will culminate now in recommendations towards around the back end of August, September, where these recommendations then will also have a number of various action steps that we want to make sure that these action steps are measurable, and the outcome of that being that we should be able to monitor the implementation that we would want to see happening, and those will be then handed over to the government around September, which will then form the basis of the engagement also by the various G20 leaders, government leaders.
You talk about global collaboration, and of course, I imagine there are fears around the Trump administration, around tariffs, around the suggestion that, it might be much harder to trade with the US. Is that already coming through in the discussions?
Well, we are about to start the discussions. Remember that today, in the last 2 days, we've launched the B20, and what you've got to appreciate is that some of these task forces are task forces that come from various other B20 presidencies. So issues of trade, issues of digital transformation, issues about financing, issues about sustainability, around climate change issues. These are issues that have really been part of what business leaders and have been advocating for policies that are addressing this. So I think what has also changed is the fact that obviously the geopolitics of the time also necessitates to, insofar as how one can amend and adjust some of these policies so that as we move forward, they become relevant to meet the issues and the challenges of the time. Now, this year's B20 is really an Africa B20. We are the host, but it's really around issues that are really impacting, and also the prospects of growth, trade, and all of other issues around financing that inhibit and they limit the ability for Africa to actually grow in the manner that it should grow. And these are the challenges that we have to be dealing with.
Mxolisi, I can understand this is a moment that calls for diplomatic language, and you're a co-chair, and there are a large number of people involved, and I understand all of those difficulties. But I do wonder if this might be a moment for business groups and for South Africa, I think, to lead a kind of campaign in favor of global trade, rules-based trade, in favor of multilateral institutions like the G20, just to remind certain people, but really all of us, why these are important. Could this be a good moment for South African business to do that?
Absolutely. And then, remember, what we have come to accept that, in as much as you do have a lot of geopolitics that from time to time, play a factor in terms of, the issues that global leaders have to deal with. There is consensus around the business leaders that ours as business, trade will always be there. It doesn't matter who is, which government is in power. And issues around climate change are things that we always have to be dealing with. So our focus is really to ensure that we support these multilateral institutions, advocate for their strengthening and in some instances, but also take into account issues around equitable financing that enables countries and especially of the global south to have a fair what I would say, and even playing field in terms of how they can get access to finance, because there is always this issue around Africa being, for instance, being a very, very high risk area, and therefore the cost of financing also talks to the reasons why countries find themselves highly indebted. But when you look at the actual data itself, it doesn't talk to that story. You'll find that a lot of some countries in the north who get equitable and much more favorable financing terms are actually much more risky insofar as their outlook. But now the institutions, like the rating institutions, tend to have a very distorted sometimes view about that risk, which causes these types of financing costs. So we are challenging those to say that no, we've got to relook at how risk is being assessed and how our financing now starts becoming available in a much more equitable manner to the emerging markets, and especially within Africa, where we have been very much penalized for the issues around how risk is being managed.
Mxolisi Mgojo, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate the time, sir. Co-chair of the Business 20. You may remember him as a former CEO at Exaro, among other things. Well, while the Business 20 underway in Cape Town, our agriculture sector also looking at ways they can work with other countries, and particularly on our continent. Wandile Mgojo, as you know, an agricultural economist. Wandile, good evening. You suggested there's actually a lot of work we could do with farmers in other parts of our continent. Climate change is affecting all of us, for example. Is there a lot of knowledge we can share and gain from that kind of process?
I was beginning to worry, Stephen, that in all of these big global conversations you are skipping farmers. We have a lot to share, Stephen. I think the core part is on trade, which links to Mxolisi's conversation. One, within the G20, a number of countries that are there are the ones that, as South Africa, we trade a lot with. If you think about the EU countries, 20% of our agricultural exports go to the EU. And I think in this environment where there's a lot of friction, this conversation around the B20, G20 offers an opportunity to, again, anchor that point that open trade is important. That's the one point. The second aspect is that a number of these developed countries are far advanced when it comes to climate change adaptability. And I think in terms of knowledge sharing, learning about what are they doing with regards to smart climate agricultural practices that we can impact not only in South Africa but greater continent will be my second point. Third, I would say fertilizer, because if you think about the African agricultural story, with the exception of South Africa and Zambia, we do have a low productivity challenge, and I think it lies around the fertilizer aspect. So with those three and technology as the last one, Stephen, I would say those are key things that at least at a business level of this G20 we should include in our deliberation.
I mean, it's always interesting to me that we sell quite a lot of things to people who are very far away. China, the US, Europe. That's why Spain's always trying to keep our oranges out. We could be surely doing a lot more trade with Africa if Botswana will let us.
Absolutely, Stephen. We are trying to do a lot of trade with the continent and doing some. But I do think that you are right. We have a lot of things to eye on within SACU and some of the trade friction that we are having. And I think as South Africa, our approach even to the region shouldn't be that of a sort of being disgruntled, because with all of the challenges that are there just in SACU makes up about 20% of South Africa's agricultural exports, which is almost the same value that we get from the EU, but of different products, which means then that the posture and the way that we engage with the region is important. The African continent as a whole is about 40% of South Africa's agricultural exports. But I think the core conversation within the G20 countries is saying, look, we are all prospering in terms of trade. We see the geopolitics and where they are leading, but for the long-term sustainability of all of our sectors and the economies, open trade begins to be important. This is true for us, and I think this is true to the points that Mxolisi was highlighting for other sectors of the economy.
Wandile Mgojo, thank you. Author, agricultural economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber.
The Money Show.
The markets.
Ryan Hills, head of fundamental sales at ABSA CIB. Ryan, good evening. Thanks for coming in. Big sell-off on cryptocurrencies, I presume inspired in part by the hack over the weekend. North Korea seems to have been involved.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Good to be here. Look, I mean, unfortunately, the idea of tariffs always raises its ugly head at the moment. And just reading through the financial press this afternoon before coming through, this sell-off in Bitcoin, for example, is being associated with that as well. But there's no doubt that there's probably some increased risk aversion associated with, as you say, this hack which was supposedly perpetrated by the North Koreans. I mean, fascinating to see that Bitcoin itself today down 7%. I think Solana, which is another one of the sort of mainstream coins, down almost 50% from its peak.
Gee.
Bitcoin itself now sitting below $90,000. It peaked at about $109,000 late last year. So, as I say, tariffs seem to be playing a role, leading to this idea that there's a risk-off environment for investors at the moment. What's also quite fascinating is you see that it seems as though there's a flow of money into the US bond market, which is normally associated with risk-off as well. And in fact, it does also suggest that we could be seeing that the US bond markets are starting to suggest that the Fed's going to have to cut rates further. Because if tariffs do come through, that's presumably going to mean higher prices, lower growth for the economy, and as a consequence, Fed's going to have to do something to stimulate. And as I can see from Bloomberg today, for example, it sounds as though the consensus expectation is for 2 rate cuts this year. In South Africa, we're still penciling in 1, but presumably if the Fed cuts 2, we'll probably do 2 as well.
Don't let the governor hear you say that. Woolworths is up quite nicely today. In fact, quite a few retail shares up between 2 and 4%. And they all seem to be kind of almost moving together, and I could not find a rational explanation for it.
Yeah, same here. Look, I mean, we obviously scoured the news flow for today, and we couldn't really see anything other than a few broker reports that got released. I'd say that in general, I mean, there's been something like a 20 to 30% pullback for the retailers since their peaks in, call it, late November. And looking through the consensus earnings expectations, it doesn't really seem as though the market's starting to pencil in much better numbers yet. Having said that, and of course we've seen the updates from the retailers come through, the numbers seem to have disappointed the market overall. But it does feel as though there's probably a bit of bottom picking starting to happen. Some investors possibly starting to say, well, this might be the low, and likely we've still got some tailwinds, assuming, of course, that load shedding doesn't come to stay. We could have some tailwinds for the retailers and, for the economy as a whole, and therefore it might make sense to start picking up these names at these sort of prices.
Well done for keeping interest rates and inflation out of that. Can't get away from interest rates at the moment. MTN up 2%. Obviously a lot going on there. I think it was Telkom were also up today.
Yeah, the telco operators in general up 2% thereabouts. The one news flow that seems to be coming through for MTN at the moment is that the telco operators in Nigeria are now starting to implement the 50% tariff increases. So that seemed to buoy that particular stock. Having said that, looking through some Nigerian newspapers earlier today, it sounds as though there is a broad consumer backlash that's starting to emerge. And in fact, I've seen one of the newspapers suggest that those tariffs could actually be cut to as little as, call it, 30%, which is still, better than zero. And in fact, it's the first tariff increase we've had since 2013 or thereabouts. So I think even if there is a bit of backtracking, it will probably still be seen in a very positive way by the market.
I mean, of course, people will just go to WhatsApp, won't they? They'll find a Wi-Fi spot and do that. And then Kumba down 5%.
Yeah, Kumba seems to be coming under a bit of pressure simply because of what seems to be some headwinds for iron ore pricing in China. Our house view remains that we probably are going to see elevated stockpiles of iron ore and therefore less buying, and as a consequence probably continued pressure there. Bearing in mind, of course, that the primary use of iron ore is in the steel industry, and the primary use of steel, you could argue, is in the property space, which continues to be under pressure in China. So not expecting to see any major great shakes there anytime soon.
Ryan Hill, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Really appreciate it. Head of Fundamental Sales at ABSA CIB. In a moment, Sekanati Manchansha, not to give you a voice note about anything in particular, but to talk about, you may remember, but to talk about his investigation in which it does seem that several fund managers actually lost quite a lot of money in Enable Capital, which is beginning to look more and more like a scam.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by ABSA Corporate and Investment Banking, reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth at Beyond the Budget 2025.
18 minutes now to 7 the time. Good to hear from you this evening on 011 8830702 and 0214460567. Been thinking a little bit about that cryptocurrency hack that seems to have been backed by North Korea over the weekend, $1.5 billion taken. And it just reminded me of how difficult it is now to trust someone you're transacting with. I mean, already and for a long time, if someone phones you and wants to talk about money, you actually can't trust them to talk about money. And the problem with this is that over time, I mean, there would have been a time when cold calling would have worked as a legitimate kind of way to drum up business. Hi, I'm a plumber, you know, and you can't do things like that anymore because there's no trust. And it sort of ties in with the point I was making last week about the cost of crime, which we don't really talk about. Every time something is stolen, there's a massive reduction in value. Value is lost. In this case, what's happening is that every time someone's trust is broken or you're lied to or there's a scam, you find that actually you can't then trust people. And there's a fascinating example, and you can Google this if you like, but I mean, in recent times, about a month ago, an actor from China was in Thailand on holiday, was abducted, taken across the border into Myanmar, and forced to work at a scam factory. There are plenty of these things, by the way. And as a result, and this is how people make money, you know, forced to work in the scam factory, I should point out, and so are many other people. And that means that, you know, just interactions on social media, anything, you suddenly find that you just can't trust the person anymore. And there must be such a financial cost to that. And you could say it's because of how the world has changed, it's become more virtual, more social media. Well, not always, because more information is now coming out about what seems to have been a scam in which investment firms and the Public Investment Corporation have lost millions of rand that involves that company. We first touched on this last week. It's called Enable Capital. It said it would help smaller companies manage the delay between providing a service and getting paid. And News 24 reported last week the PIC had confirmed losing money. Now it's reporting that the company's Old Mutual Alternative Investments, Mason Global, Prescient, and Westbrook Partners also invested money in this company. Sikonati Manchancha is the person who broke this story. Sikonati is a writer at large at News 24. Sikonati, good evening. I mean, do we know at this point how much money's been lost here?
Stephen, Peter Dito, you'll be very upset with you. I'm an investigations writer at News 24. Do we know how much money? It's between 485 million rands and 750 million rands, Stephen. Those are the numbers that I have seen any correspondence, any documentation about. And certainly three of the people affected by this have given me those numbers too.
It's a huge amount of money. How was someone able to do this? I mean, for the moment, they seem to have got away with it.
Stephen, it does appear they did get away with it, and no one has a clue how it happened. According to the documents that I have seen and some of the witnesses I spoke to, the 100 million rands that was invested by the PIC disappeared within 5 days. The rest of the money had been invested over some period of time. For example, Old Mutual Asset Alternative Investments had invested during April 2023, and they only became aware that things are not going very well late last year, as the others did find out when the business was put on business rescue. So no one knows exactly what happened, and all the parties to this are not exactly keen to talk about it.
No, I'm sure. So the only thing that blew the whistle then was the going into business rescue. No one knew what was going on before that. And I suppose I then have to ask, I mean, what do we know about how it ended up in business rescue? It's such a strange story.
Stephen, it was the board of the company itself, the directors of Enable Capital, that voted and put a resolution and placed the business the company in business rescue. So it was a voluntary thing by the owners of the business, the very people that should have the answers, all the answers to the disappeared money. They then decided, let's put this thing in business rescue, and a business rescue practitioner will be appointed to deal with it. And the task of that person, of course, is to one, not only just recover as much of the money as possible, but also to help the authorities and those investors find out what happened to the money and hold whoever is responsible for it accountable.
Where is that investigation now? I mean, it's a large amount of money. There must be every incentive on the part of the people who've lost it to get it back. And I imagine they might not just be using the police or the Hawks. They'll be conducting their own investigation in some way.
Stephen, Zahir Kasim is the business rescue practitioner that was appointed, and a business rescue process seeks to protect or get as much value out or salvage as much value for the creditors. In this instance, these fund managers that deposited up to 750 million rands. The business rescue practitioner would only say that they have launched a forensic investigation. We know a bit more from people who have spoken about who is doing that forensic investigation, but I can tell you now it only just is starting. There is nothing at this moment that can be said of that investigation. And when it is finally done, then hopefully it will be made public, because also there are public monies involved here, owned by the government employees pension fund, which is invested by the Public Investment Corporation, which was also blindsided to this. We have no clue at this point what happened to the money or how long the investigation will take before anyone gets any answers.
It took quite a lot for you to be able to, maybe force is the wrong word, but gently encourage Sekunati, these companies, to come forward to confirm to you that they had lost this money. I imagine it wasn't quite gently encouraged. Could there be others? I mean, the fact that they've stayed so silent, there might be others who don't want to say anything.
Stephen, a few did finally come out after quite a bit of nudging, firm nudging at some points. In some points, they did come out and confirm Sanlam Investments lost more than 100 million rands. Old Mutual Alternative Investments, which deleted from its website statements that were relating to their initial investment, finally came out to confirm they have lost 150 million rands. There were others too. So what has been confirmed by the companies that have lost is currently in the region of about 450 million rands. But companies like Prescience Investment, Mason Global, and others simply pretended they don't exist, or that I don't exist, and they did not at all engage in the conversation. Those that did engage in the case of Prescient Investment just gave a very long public relations statement that did everything to not answer any of the questions I had put to them, including how much did you lose. But we know from other sources, all of them lost more than 60 million rands each.
I mean, I would think what's probably going to happen is that each of these institutions will presumably, behind closed doors, look at who made the decision. Was there anything missed? I mean, you know, we might only be able to tell from people who leave these institutions in the near future.
Stephen, large institutions such as these have governance processes where committees will conduct due diligence, and there will be others that will look at the investment opportunity and the reputation of the people they are investing with. Yet there will be others that will go high into the board who will make the final decision to actually go ahead and invest. And someone else will have to authorize the transfers to these institutions. So there's a whole lot of people that would have been involved, from all the asset managers involved. Now, the issue is, why didn't anyone pick up that there was a problem in any of this? Why didn't anyone? It's been going on for quite a while, because other companies, of course, you will know, Stephen, they are not keen to talk about it. So they won't tell you when they invested or even how they got to know of this opportunity. But it would seem the due diligence and quite a lot of those that did talk to me claimed they did thorough due diligence, but it obviously fell short of the required standard, because the money quickly disappeared into other people's pockets, it would appear.
Sekunati Mantshantsha, thank you very much indeed. Part of the investigative team at News 24. There's a fascinating story here. I'm sure a mini-series in pre-production. 8 minutes now to 7.
7:02.
7:02.
Stephen is on X.
At Stephen Grootes.
Well, a promise last night from the Gauteng Premier Panyaza Lesufi that he's going to focus on dealing with the water problems in the province. Of course, as you know, one of the major issues with providing water is simply that it comes under local government. And there's so many problems in so many parts of local government that it seems to me water supplies and the provision of water are unlikely to improve soon. I mean, in Gauteng, for example, the 3 metros and the other councils together cannot account for around half the water they receive. It's called non-metered water, that figure hovering just under 50%. The global average, probably around 20%. At the same time, of course, lots of technological changes on the go with how you can manage water. Dr. Andrew Dixon is an engineering executive at CBI Electric. And Andrew, good evening. I realize we shouldn't mix water and electricity, but I think we'll get away with it tonight. There are all sorts of ways to save water. Technology is moving quite quickly on this. What can we do as individuals and people managing homes or estates? How can you waste less water?
Good evening, Stephen. And yes, thank you. And agreed, electricity and water obviously don't mix. But again, the requirements go beyond just the basic service infrastructure. So the blending with the available technologies that we have means that we should actually be mixing them to be able to start identifying more. And as you stated, the Premier turned around and said, we need to be doing something about it. Everyone needs to be doing something. And how do we start that? So if we've got the technology available through IoT devices, we've got blueprints from other countries which are showing us that we can achieve an understanding of what the system's doing, do preventative maintenance, and therefore ensure that our billable supply comes into actually effectively gaining revenue from water that we're actually supplying into the municipality, means that we will be able to maintain our infrastructure. Obviously, we're not in that position right now, but we need to be investing and looking at these technologies to be able to get there.
Can I get to the point of the household? And I made the point earlier, but I remember before load shedding, I had no idea how much electricity I was using at home. Now I have an app on my phone. I can see literally almost down to which light is on. I can find out, how much electricity is being used, where it comes from. Can we do the same with water? I mean, would we be able to give homes detailed information on how much water they're using?
So, of course, the electricity supply in the home is easier to connect in with. As you said, there are numerous devices that are freely available that don't require necessarily an external person to be able to connect, so I don't need an electrician in. However, water becomes a little bit more problematic because you've got your main supply that's usually buried. I don't have easy access to the position where it comes in. So it does require a little bit of work and effort. However, because of the IoT devices coming online, and this is the world around, obviously you get some very nifty little devices coming out of China that allow the homeowner to start looking at these details. And, like we saw with electricity, you want to start just measuring the basic incomer. We've got the meter in the ground somewhere. You can go out and read it, but, when you're in the heat of running a bath, cooking, making sure the kids are getting to bed on time, you don't think, okay, well, let me go out and see how fast my meter is running. You just don't have that accessibility. Whereas the smart devices that are coming online will allow you to do that. And then they go to the next step. So you not only looking at just what my consumption is, they will start to tell you and indicate when they detect a small leak. And I think that's the other problem for the homeowner is when I've got a small leak that I don't know exists, my bill comes every month and I'm going, hang on, why is it so high? I have no idea. I can't see any water. And it's actually draining between the walls or underground somewhere. And you have no idea, and you're just paying and paying.
I mean, the same would obviously hold true for the council. So, I mean, the infrastructure we have in places like Joburg is very old. I think some pipes are 50 years old. I wouldn't be surprised if they're pipes that are older than that. So all of that needs to kind of either be fixed, and I think there might be some technology that would allow you to do it, or you need to actually rebuild those pipes. And I presume there'll be quite different technology to the pipes that have been used for a long time. If you're going to do a whole new system, in other words, you're going to have a lot more information coming from that new system than we have now.
Well, certainly, and again, we've seen that with electricity. We don't see it with water. Are we actually aware of what the losses are? Do we know what our input volumes are? Do we know where they're branching off? Do we understand where that loss is coming in? All the new technologies show that to us. They also go beyond just doing that. We know that Joburg had some of the best water in the world for a very long time, and we know that we've been slipping down that scale for a very long time. The modern devices will even give you an indication of quality. They'll give you an indication of the pressure in the pipes. They will give you preemptive measures to be able to say, listen, there is a problem, and I could almost pinpoint you where the problem is. It's not a case of going, wait for the water to get to the surface before I know there's actually a problem.
Dr. Andrew Dixon, thanks very much indeed. Talking, of course, about water tonight, but is also an engineering executive at CBI Electric. Fascinating just to sort of consider how this field, I think, is going to change, and probably going to change quite dramatically. If you make water more expensive, then you should care for it a lot more. The problem, of course, is that in our society, you really can't do that. I mean, you'd be asking for trouble if you did that. And I think people would absolutely be allowed to be very angry. So you need to come up with something different, something else. We'll talk a bit more about the cryptocurrency hack in a moment. Don't forget Personal Finance with Warren Ingram and Rutendo Hundingi in as well. You with The Money Show. Good evening.
And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud host of Beyond the Budget 2025, where they are reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Well, lots to come. We'll get another update on the situation around the cryptocurrency hack over the weekend. There's so many questions that I still have around it, around what exactly happened, around the implications of that. There's stories going around talking about the number of people, younger people in Africa, who are looking at trying to leave, particularly people who are educated. Rutendo Hundingi is looking at that. And then don't forget Personal Finance, Warren Ingram. Fascinating question. Are you going to do all of this to get money? Are you going to invest? You're going to spend time on it? You're going to spend energy on it? What is the money for? Intriguing question, actually. Good to hear from you tonight as well. On 011 883 0702 and 021 446 0567.
702. Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Well, Bitcoin suffering a sharp loss today. Various reasons. Some of it to do with sort of a risk-off investment environment. But also, other cryptocurrencies are down after that massive hack that saw $1.5 billion being stolen from an Ethereum wallet over the weekend. The money was stolen from a company called Bybit. Over the last 24 hours, also seeming to emerge that North Korean hackers were behind the crime, and that the North Korean government essentially is the organization that will benefit from it. Karel Diache is research lead for blockchain technology at the CSIR. Karel, good evening, and thanks so much for your time. There's still so much to look here. I get a sense that this is going to be one of those moments where maybe there'll be quite a few consequences. But is this, at the very start, a wake-up call to the entire cryptocurrency industry about its security?
Oh, that's for sure, Stephen. Yeah, so there's still a lot of questions, and there's not a lot of answers. But one thing is clear, this was a absolutely massive hack. $1.5 billion. It completely eclipses all other types of hacks that we've had and vulnerabilities and exploits that we've had in the crypto industry, and that says quite a lot. So it's a massive, massive loss. And yeah, the thing is that if you're talking about cybersecurity in cryptocurrencies, of course, it is way, way, way more important than with any other type of digital technology that you get, because there's no way that you can reverse these transactions. That money is gone. It's in the hands of the North Korean hackers, and there's absolutely no way to recover it.
We keep being told by people in the space that cryptocurrencies are very safe. They're unhackable. You can't get into these mechanisms. I mean, is that still true?
Yes, it is. So it's very important to make the distinction between the actual blockchain or the protocol and the applications that's built on top of the blockchain. So think of it as the internet and your banking application that's built on top of the internet. So, if you use that analogy, then the internet is safe and the internet cannot be hacked. Like the blockchain itself is safe and cannot be hacked. But the applications on top of them are like any application that's built on top of a protocol. They are vulnerabilities, and we're still learning these things as time goes on. The industry is still nascent, believe it or not. We're only 15 years in this, and if you go back to the internet, 15 years into the internet, we started seeing online banking accounts, for example. So it's still a new industry, and there's still a lot of things that we learn. There's definitely a lot of things that we need to get in place, like, for instance, regulations that make it safer, and standards and insurance and those kind of things we don't yet have in crypto. We have it in traditional finance, but we don't have insurance in crypto. Like, all of these things needs to be developed, and it takes time.
I mean, the whole point of crypto is that on both ends, you can't hack it, right? And there's also anonymity built into that, as I understand it. That's one of the attractions. Is you may not even know who the money is going to. If there's some sort of deal, whatever. That does mean then, as in this case, that if you've lost money, it's untraceable. You can't get it back. Is that going to have any impact on the debate around whether crypto should still be so anonymous? Could some people say, well, actually, we don't want it to be so anonymous because it's so risky, as we've now seen?
Yeah, so we can actually on the blockchain look at the crypto, and we know, for instance, that's one of the reasons why we could pinpoint the North Korean hackers, the Lazarus group, even though they denied it, but it's clear as daylight that they were behind this hack. So we could have seen those transactions actually happen on the blockchain. But one thing is unfortunately a fact, and that's a characteristic or an advantage of blockchain, but also a disadvantage is the fact that those transactions can never be reversed. Once they are executed, they are in the blockchain forever, and whoever is the owner of that currency is then the owner until they decide to dispose of that in whichever way. So the blockchain does not discriminate. There's no identities behind it. So, for instance, if a transaction like this happens, we can see that it happens, and we can obviously experience it, but we don't. But there's no ID number, right, attached to that. It's only a random number or an address that is now the beneficiary of that transaction, and there's absolutely nothing that we can really do about it other than have a look at it. And if that coin, if that Ethereum or that Bitcoin that they've stolen, if that ever ends up in a centralized exchange that does collect know your customer data and are subject to compliance and regulations, then action can be taken. But until such point, there's nothing that we can do about it.
So there are obviously plenty of places you can spend it without having to go through that legislation.
Correct. Yeah, that's also a little bit easier said than done, and we've seen that from past big hacks as well. Because now you can imagine there's a big red light shining on that wallet, and authorities and stakeholders all around the world is keeping an eye on it. Very similar to a hack that the Bitfinex hack. The Bitfinex hack had happened in 2018. It was also more than $1 billion that was stolen at the time, and the perpetrators, the attackers, couldn't do much with that money. Because they knew that they were monitored they sat on it for a long time until they made an incorrect step in which they didn't cover their tracks. They actually bought a Walmart gift card. Can you believe it? Of all things, they bought a Walmart gift card, and they were arrested shortly thereafter. This, of course, was in the U.S., and the federal agencies in the U.S. does have the tools to monitor these things and take appropriate action. That's not the case everywhere in the world, but we are looking at it. But the fact is that there's an exchange now that has a $1.5 billion hole in its balance sheet. That is massive. And luckily, it seems like they've recovered. I don't know how. Magically, they've recovered and they filled that hole. But so yeah, it remains a very big knock.
So there are lots of questions one can have about ordinary banking. You know, people say they use crypto because there are problems with ordinary banking, and that crypto is kind of clean and pure. And some people, as I'm sure you know, Carl, kind of think it's going to save humanity. Maybe not. But it seems to me that maybe this is a reminder that actually crypto is a bit more like ordinary banking. There are still risks, and for the crypto industry to survive, it's going to have to start to manage those risks. In other words, crypto is going to become maybe a little bit more like ordinary banking than it is now.
Yeah, and there are advantages and disadvantages of that happening. Of course, crypto does enable you to be fully self-sovereign. you having full custody of your own assets. But with that, obviously, comes massive responsibilities and risks to some people. Some people are not meant to have custody of their assets in such a dramatic fashion, because obviously, if you lose that, if you're not looking at that responsibly, then there's no turning back and there's no recovery of those assets. So, with the advantage of having money or assets that are outside of central control and outside of authorities and outside of and that you have full control over. With that obviously comes massive responsibility. You have to do inheritance planning and so on. So with any exchange, any application that's built on top of the blockchain, there are risks now, like for instance the SAC, because those exchanges, those applications that's built on the blockchain can be vulnerable, they can be infiltrated, and you can lose your money. And we've seen it now so many times in crypto. But then the other side of that coin, where you take your assets actually off of these exchanges and off of these applications, and you decide to keep it in your own wallet, and you keep your own keys, and you have full control over those assets, that's just as dangerous. I know of many, many, many examples. My inbox are full of it, of people that do that and then they get it wrong. Then they don't do proper inheritance planning, for example, of this new asset class, and they end up losing their assets as well. So it is at this point a matter of educating yourself, really knowing where the risks are, and that's easier said than done, I understand, getting the necessary professional assistance, and then making a choice as to whether you are better off leaving your assets on a centralized service such as this or taking control of that.
I get the sense that even 5 years from now, crypto is going to look very different again.
Yes. There's a lot happening behind the scenes. It is absolutely crazy. So, for instance, the Financial Action Task Force, since they've grey-listed South Africa, they've made very, very explicit recommendations as to some of the things that needs to be done. This is now more aimed towards money laundering and terrorist financing, of course. But their recommendations also have a lot to do with the safety of investors. There is the World Bank. There are many different of these global watchdogs that has extremely explicit recommendations, and we're seeing those things play out now. We're seeing a lot of it implemented on South African exchanges, on global exchanges. The crypto industry is really changing at a massive pace, and some of it for the better, some of it for the worse, unfortunately. There are things that I do not agree with, some of the regulations, but there are a lot of things that makes the space safer, easier to use, and the cryptocurrency industry needs to go through this, just like the internet went through it in the 90s. We need to go through this so we end up in a space that is open for everyone, and not only for a select few.
Carl de Jager, I really appreciate the time. Thank you. Research lead for blockchain technology at the CSIR.
WhatsApp Stephen
on 072
702
1702.
Time to find out what's happening on our continent now. Dr. Rutendo Ndungwe, founding director at Tribe Africa Advisory, author of the book Rumble in the Jungle Reloaded, having a look at Africa Business Focus. Rutendo, good evening. Good to see you. I've had Ethiopian coffee in my time. I've had Kenyan coffee in my time. I had no idea Uganda was selling so much coffee.
Yeah, it's actually an interesting fact, and a good evening to you, Steve, and to your listeners. So, Uganda is a country, has a GDP of 49 billion, coincidentally a population of 49 million. So, GDP per capita is $1,000 per capita. And you're right. Ethiopia actually produces more coffee than Uganda, and per unit, and a unit is 60 kgs. Ethiopia produces about 8.5 million units per year. Uganda produces 8.1 million units per year. The only big difference is that Ethiopia consumes more of its coffee because it's part of their culture, it's part of their heritage. Uganda only consumes like 3%, exports the rest. But the headline story here is that the coffee production for Uganda, if you look at January this year compared to January last year, has gone up by 83%, which is a significant boost. Some of the key contributions of that are obviously coming from key players in the coffee export market are Vietnam and Brazil, and they've had a bad weather season.
World coffee prices have been at record highs.
Commodity, yes,
35 years, yeah.
So you and I should definitely drink more coffee because there's money there. Another key factor to realize about Uganda is that it earns about $860 million of coffee exports, which translates to about 22% of its exports. So I think that's a big thing to realize. And coincidentally, the biggest buyer of Ugandan coffee after the Europeans. No, it's before the European market. Is actually Sudan. And that's because they use it as part of their culture. They've got the demand for it. They don't grow as much coffee. So it's an interesting dynamic with regards to coffee because, like you said, people think Ethiopia is the big place, but Uganda is actually quite a key player. And obviously, when you're looking about AGOA, one of the big target markets is the US, and coffee is one of the AGOA trade items. And another also key statistic that is there is that when I was just analyzing this, Stephen, is that I talked about the consumption being 3%, but there are about 330 million trees of coffee in Uganda. And these are small-scale farmers with the biggest brands being Robusta and Arabica. So another exciting story with regards to coffee and the space in terms of what's happening in the Ugandan market.
It's really interesting. It also shows you how whether you consume it or not really matters. It really, it really does.
It does.
The National Oil Corporation in Libya, it needs reform. Libya's, it's a complex country.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, this will be very difficult, and oil really matters to them.
Yeah, and it's always a challenge to find a positive story in Libya. They've gone through a war. They're still coming out of it. Its GDP per capita, Stephen, is about $6,200 per capita. So it's not a poor country per capita. Infrastructure-wise, there's a lot of stuff. Oil plays a key role. But one of the key things is that Libya is making a lot of key initiatives with regards to developing and reforming its oil production. Just some key facts about Libya. It's the 7th largest crude oil producer in OPEC. It's the 7th largest crude oil producer in OPEC from a global perspective. Libya is the 3rd largest total petroleum liquids producer in Africa after Nigeria and Algeria, which you also know are quite big in oil production. They are producing at the moment, Stephen, about 1.4 billion barrels per day of crude oil, and they want to up that to 2 million. They need about $4 billion, so it's quite a significant amount. Funny enough, because of corruption, or let me be diplomatic, unaccountable records, they've lost about $7 billion worth of money in the oil value chain, and you can see that if that has gone back into the country, the significance would have had. But I think a key thing that stuck out for me, Stephen, besides just in terms of the reforms that they're putting together and the drive they're doing in terms of expanding their oil production, Libya, both on land and sea, they still have, after all these significant inroads they've had with oil and the production over the years, they still have about 50% of both land and sea space that is unexplored that potentially can produce more oil. So, as you can imagine, if they were in the right political framework, in the right policy framework, with the right kind of funding, Libya would be a different player altogether in terms of economic power from a continental perspective.
And then Nigeria wants to sort of take back its place as one of the top cocoa producers. To say that right,
yeah,
it helps if you say Coke. Never mind. But they want to overtake Ghana, and it's a massive crop, and you can make a ton of money from it.
Yeah, I think agriculture is on the roll. So obviously, cocoa a key raw material for chocolate, which both you and I enjoy. So. Ghana, is when we look at the big players of cocoa in Africa, Ghana produces about 650,000 metric tons. Nigeria is currently about 500,000 metric tons. The big boy is Cote d'Ivoire, who's on 2.2 million metric tons and one of the leaders in the world. But with this significant story, British International Investment, which is the arm of investment and used to be called CDC, if you remember in the old days, Stephen, has injected about $40.5 million. They've partnered up with the local agribusiness called Johantis, which focuses in terms of cocoa production. Nigeria itself, if you go back to 1960, was actually the world's 2nd largest producer of cocoa. And what happened that it discovered oil. So the Dutch disease crept in, and 80% of its export over time shifted to oil. So what they're trying to do, Stephen, is they're trying to resuscitate this market and create a bit of focus. The other big players in terms of cocoa on the continent is Ghana, I've mentioned, and Cameroon as well. But just to give you some numbers in terms of the opportunity and the quantum of the value chain there. Last year, cocoa was priced at about $1,800 per kg. This year, it's priced at about $10,000 per kg. So you can see the way the commodity market has just shifted in that space. And obviously, Nigeria trying to position itself strategically, sees the opportunity, and hopefully with time they'll get it right. So it's an exciting story, and I think it just creates an ecosystem of competition on the continent, which is just right.
More information, more evidence that a large number of our young people actually want to leave the continent after they finish studying, and this has been a perennial problem. And I did wonder, despite the fact that the rest of the world might be turning into a slightly more dangerous place, or let me say a more difficult place, it still seems to be the case that people want to go.
Yeah, that's true, Stephen. So recent research has shown that a third or 35% of African students plan to leave Africa after completing their education. So that's not you and me, Stephen. I think we've passed the young barrier. But with many seeking higher education and job opportunities in the US, Canada, the UK, and Europe. And I think the push factor or the pull factor, you can look at it both ways, is really in terms of education and money. And a better living. And I think Africa, you've got certain countries that can accommodate them. But if you don't have a job and you've got a skill, then that's always a challenge. If you look at the survey, Stephen, another key statistic that comes out of there is that 64% of African employers express concerns about the impact of brain drain, and multinationals contributed about 72% of that. But I think a key thing that's turning the dial, Stephen, and is playing an absolutely critical role, and something we mustn't take for granted, is that people are wanting to get educated in the right areas, so AI, technology, innovation, and a lot of the first world countries have got that. But another big thing that is happening is the diaspora has grown. So I think the report, Stephen, surveyed that in 1990 there were about 0.7 million, so 700,000 young people went overseas to get educated, have a better living. And in 2015 it went to 3.6 million. And they're sending back remittances, and the remittances over a period, I think they are coming on average to about $100 billion US. So there's a shift in terms of the geoeconomics, even though there's a negative social impact. And if there's a way to harness this in a positive way, then it would be great, Stephen.
Well, I mean, Europe's population is going to start declining. China's is declining. They're going to need workers just to pay the pensions for the older people there. And also, when you have these networks of people, the diaspora gets bigger. Yeah. It's much easier to go to London and spend Saturday watching Zimbabwean football.
You got me there. Definitely Zimbabwean football is in great demand in Europe, especially if my team Chelsea is not performing. But I think it just talks about an opportunity here. But I think what it highlights at the end of the day, our skills are in demand. And if we're able to translate those skills in terms of it's sort of physically going out, but retaining them here and exporting the skill and getting revenue, I think Africa will be in a better place. And you can actually see that in terms of the outshoring trends. Africa is picking up as a source, as a destination for skills. So it's an exciting time. I think it's a good problem to have.
Dr. Rutendo Hundungi, good to see you. Thank you. Founding Director at Tribe Africa Advisory, bringing the time to 7:30.
7:02 with Stephen Grootes.
Email him on stephen@702.co.za.
On the next Money Show, the SA Breweries boss Richard Rivette Carnac and the head honcho at Bidcore, David Cleesby, will take you through the respective companies' financial results. Graham Codrington, the futurist and partner at Tomorrow Today, with the latest on Business Unusual. Also, your consumer ninja, Wendy Nola, will be fighting for your consumer rights, one ninja move at a time.
The Money Show.
Personal Finance with Warren Ingram.
Well, Warren is being a little bit provocative tonight, because instead of just talking about how to make as much money or how to make sure that you are comfortable in retirement, he's asking us the question, what is your money for? Warren Ingram is a certified financial planner at Galileo Capital. Warren, good evening. It's a fascinating question. Clearly you have a reason for asking it. What is your money for?
It's such a simple question to ask someone, and often when I pose the question to people, they don't really have a straightforward answer, and it's not a criticism. I think it's pretty common for all of us. We kind of tend to get on the hamster wheel of life, and we know we've got to get educated. Then whether we finish after school or after tertiary education, the first thing we've got to do is get a job, and then we just get going, and the bills pile up, and we do everything we can to pay the bills and make our way, and so life progresses. And it's very rare that we take the time just to stop and go, okay, what am I doing all of this for? And it's not a philosophical question. I'm not asking to kind of start a philosophy class, but rather to try and find the core, the real motivation that makes you kind of get up in the morning, other than just obligation. Because I feel my experience from watching people do this for the last 30 years is those that kind of bounce out of bed and have fairly successful careers, families, post-retired lives, they do it because they've got some kind of a purpose that they work towards, that they're driving the bus and they're not just sitting in the back seat hoping to get from point A to point B. And so very often it's one of the first questions I'll ask somebody is you're here, we're chatting, and what is your money for? And I mean, maybe the first point, Stephen, is we tend to think of money as a end goal. I want to have enough, and I want to be rich, or I want enough to buy the private plane, or just get through the month would be great, whatever it is. And actually, the first thing to understand is money is simply a tool. It's there, and like any tool, it can be extremely helpful or extremely harmful. And I always feel if we want to do life successfully, and money is a tool to help us do that, we have to figure out the thing that makes us kind of get excited and gives us motivation to get through the difficult times and make the difficult trade-offs which we always have to make around our money. Just ask our Minister of Finance.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, especially at this particular time. I suppose one of the first questions to ask is, what are the sort of big things that you're going to have to pay for? So if you're young, you at some point might want to get married. If you're a bit older, maybe your children are planning weddings. I mean, what are the kind of things that you need to think about in terms of what the big events might be, or big life events that lie in your future?
Yeah. So we have, let's just say you and I have got a victim on the couch, and it's my job to find out what their purpose is. What's the thing that really motivates them? The almost immediate answer, I'm fairly sure, will be, I just want to get through the month. I just want to pay the bills, or whatever the deal is. And that's not the answer. And so to help people think about that, one of the questions to ask is, what are the big life events that you think are in your future? For, as you said, for younger people, starting careers, they might be in a serious relationship. They might be planning weddings. And I think, I believe it's, if my wedding was any experience, it's a pretty major event. It's a pretty major life event. But if you're older and you're past that stage, it might be about having children, or potentially you've got adult children and then they've got grandchildren. And for a lot of grandparents, the responsibility that they originally felt for their own children shifts onto their grandkids. They want to make sure that their grandkids are going to be educated correctly and be able to be looked after. So it's understanding those big life events and again, back to the question, what is your money for? It might well be that you want to educate your children, or you want to provide for your grandchildren, and if that's a goal and that's something that really motivates you, then you're starting to understand what your money is for, the thing that you're really working for, or saving for, or investing for. But for other people, it will be totally different. For some people, they're in the grind of work. They really can't stand work, and all they're trying to do is raise enough money just to get to the point where they get to some form of retirement. And so for them, the motivation is how fast can they accumulate the money to get to the point of not having to work for a boss and maybe just taking some time out for themselves. So I think that it's asking questions of yourself, and potentially, if you're in a relationship, you and your partner having those conversations, because I think we go nowhere if we don't have a map in our minds of where we want to go, and then we just drift along, and that seems to be an issue so many of us face all around our country and all around the world.
I mean, a lot of it, I suppose, is also about preparation for things. I mean, you might pass away in an accident. Something might happen. Someone in your family might be badly hurt, for example. You do kind of need to sort of plan for life, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
You're right, and I think a lot of the time we don't think about these things. So, if it's important for you to be a provider and a breadwinner for your family, and you feel it's your job to take care of them, especially for younger families, it's not then just a saving conversation. It's also that protection conversation. It's protecting your ability to earn. It's making sure that you've got a will that's lined up correctly, so that if something happens to you and your partner, that your children will be looked after both legally and also financially. So it's making sure all of the things around your money line up for what's most important for you. And I think a lot of the time, people are stuck with these big decisions and just going nowhere and no framework to make those calls. I mean, just to jump forward. One of the other big issues might well be, I don't know whether to buy a house, or, I'd rather drive a fancy car. Why do I need to spend all this money on a home? And that's not a simple question to answer for a planning conversation. What's more important is to say, what's key to you? What will motivate you? If providing a house for your family is really important, then that's the reason you're not going to blow the money on a big car. But if you've got no family, or maybe, providing for them is not your most important priority, only you can answer the question, then by all means go and spend the money on the car and, let the family sort themselves out if that's really what drives you. So it's again, it's about understanding what's really core to you as a human, what's going to make you make those big trade-offs. And we all have to make trade-offs. We're in a position where we don't earn an infinite amount of money every month, and we've got always more demands on our money than we've got money. So what is the thing that's going to kind of stop you spending the money on things that are not necessary, and then allow you to spend money on the things that give you meaning, give you purpose, and give you direction, and help you kind of stay a bit more aligned with your goals, and therefore more motivated?
There are also questions, whether you have a family or not, about yourself in terms of, do you enjoy your work, for example? Some of us will continue to work for as long as they let me. For some of us, you really just want to finish it as soon as you can. You want to, if you could turn 65 tomorrow and retire, you would. Those are quite personal questions and very different for everyone. And you may also think you want to do this forever, but actually get there and you don't.
And again, it's what a shock. If that was your plan at age 40 and you get to age 60 and you think, well actually I've planned to work for another 5 years at least, and now at the age of 60, that's the last thing I could possibly think of doing. It's just anything will be better than this, and so understanding yourself and the goals is important. Equally, that your goals might change. I know my 30-year-old self, the goals I had were fundamentally different to my 40-year-old self, and I'll tell you in a while what my 50-year-old self thinks. But what I do know is that if I find the thing that's important to me for now, then I tend to line everything up. I feel better, I exercise better, I sleep better, I work harder, and work doesn't feel like a grind. And I think that those are important things. And there will be people that will just be at work to get through the day, and they don't like their jobs, and they're not in a position to do anything about it. And for them, if you're sitting listening to this and saying, well, there's no way I can change my career, then it's a case of saying, what else is important to you? What outside of work and potentially outside of family is motivating for you, and what are you doing about that? So for some people, it's working for animal welfare, or it's kind of donating time to education. It'll be the things that make you feel fulfilled, and it certainly won't always be about money. And one of the great questions to ask yourself is, what do I do when I'm no longer working? What happens when I no longer have an ability to earn an income? What am I going to do with my time? And what would excite me with being able to spend time on something completely different?
I suppose that's also like the key thing. What gets you going in the morning? There are other questions, of course, too. If you get into financial difficulty, for example, what do you need to prioritize? And those are things that you need to plan for while you can. But if you find yourself in that situation, many will at the moment, for example, there are things that you need to prioritize in terms of just making sure that, keeping the show on the road.
this is a controversial point because a lot of people would say, for example, maybe what you've got to do is pay off your mortgage first and make sure that your savings and investments don't get compromised. And I think if you're in a position like this, again, having a clear idea of what's important to you helps you to make very difficult decisions. So if you're in a position like this, understand your priorities first, and then make the difficult calls. What I will say is there are no great decisions in a situation like this. What you're doing is trading off one tough decision against another tough decision. But for me, if you're in a position where you've got a family, then number one, it sounds so basic, but I think a lot of people get frozen in a situation like this, and they're unable to make the big decisions. And so, very basically, you start with, I've got some money coming into my bank account. The first thing I need to do is make sure that everybody's fed, including yourself, because, in a situation like this, you might be the breadwinner. And so if you're not looking after yourself and your ability to keep working, then you put everybody at a greater risk. So looking after yourself from a really basic needs point of view is important. And then it will be, again, you've got tough decisions. So my view is, being able to kind of, switch the lights on and have electricity and let everyone, kind of do their most basic health issues. So making sure you've got water, for example, is important. Making sure you've got medical aid is important. If you need transport to get to work to earn an income, then transport is important. But it's surely not the big fancy car. You're in desperate times now, so make sure you're making those tough calls. The trickier one will be, and I'm a financial planner saying this, but you might need to pause investing. You might need to pause all your savings. That's an incredibly important goal to grow your savings and your investments. But when you're in an emergency, you're doing financial triage, then pausing your savings and investments is a no-brainer. It's a thing you might have to do. And potentially you might need to stall paying your rent for a month or paying your mortgage for a month. If you can't feed your family, hopefully you can feed your family and find a way to pay the mortgage and get it back. I'm certainly not saying if you've got the ability to pay your mortgage, don't do it. I'm saying you must pay your mortgage if you can. But if you're in these tough situations, figure out what is most important to you first, and then start to make these very, very difficult trade-off decisions.
I mean, there's a lot there about being strategic, and it's easy if you find yourself in that position to kind of lose your mind a little bit.
We would. I mean, it's human nature. If you put us under enough pressure, our brains are likely to go to our most basic needs, which is we're going to run, we're going to freeze, or we're going to fight. And those basic emotions are great when we're in a real physical danger situation, but they're terrible for helping you to make proper calls. So if you're in this position, I think one of the things you might want to do is just spend some time with someone you trust, hopefully someone that's fairly sensible and someone that's not in the financial position that you're in, and talk them through where you are. Tell them your position and soundboard the ideas that you're thinking of and listen to what they're telling you. It's very easy for people who are outside of your position to give you an input that you might not see because everything just feels entirely overwhelmed. And in that situation, having a good kind of co-pilot or a good navigator, just a trusted friend or a trusted family member might be the difference between making good decisions that get you through the worst and get you back on your feet, and making really lousy decisions that make the problems a lot worse.
We're speaking to Warren Ingram, co-founder of Galileo Capital, of course, personal finance this evening. There's a question from Robert for you, Warren. He says, my younger child is finishing school. My older child is starting second year at university. What is the correct age to talk to them about finances and the possibility they might inherit some money from me? I don't want them to expect to live off their inheritance. I want them to work hard and maintain motivation for life. But I also want to educate them and prepare them for the future. It's a great question from Robert. We'll have an answer from Warren in a moment.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth at Beyond the Budget 2025.
The Money Show.
Personal Finance with Warren Ingram.
Warren Ingram, of course. The question coming from Robert for you, Warren. My younger child's finishing school. My older child's at second year university. When should I talk to them about finances and the possibility they might inherit some money? I don't want them to expect to live off that, and I want them to work hard, but I do want to educate them. It's a great question from Robert, Warren.
It's a brilliant one, and it's a problem a lot of parents face. Especially people that have been incredibly cautious with their money, tended not to be flashy or to spend close to what they earn. They get to a stage of life where they've been very prudent, been very careful, and they've managed to scrape together some investments. And at some point, they become surprised at the size of those investments. And then they get faced with this problem that Robert's in now, which is we've got more money than we thought we would accumulate. It's certainly more than we had growing up, and we're able to provide for our children. But we haven't had much of a conversation with our kids about this stuff. And so parents in this situation often put themselves in their children's shoes. In other words, they think, if I start to tell them that there is going to be some money left behind when I'm gone, they might take their foot off the pedal and they might just relax and there's a lovely phrase, they become trustafarians. They become kids who live off the trust fund babies, and there is of course the potential that happens, but at the same time, if you don't talk to your kids about this and you die at 70 years old and you leave behind a significant amount of money because you've had that habit of a lifetime of being cautious and prudent and maybe a bit careful with the way you spend, you might well be leaving behind a bigger problem than you think, because people who haven't been taught by their parents how to deal with money, especially if they are going to inherit some, this could be a shock. It's a little bit like winning the lottery. There aren't many very happy stories about people who win the lottery. Mostly they're very sad stories. And so that would be my message to Robert, is you have to get your children accustomed to the idea that they have to participate in financial decisions. The answer very simply to the question is, if your kids are late high school, early university, it's a fantastic time to start getting them used to the idea that there might be some money. And it could start with allocating them, a small amount. It could be, you help them set up an investment portfolio, that doesn't damage you financially if they do make terrible mistakes. And then you go and become a co-manager with them. So you sit down once a month and you say, this is money that you could use in the future. If you look after it correctly, this could be the deposit on a house. And so you start to teach them lessons about how to make decisions, how to think about their money over the longer term. What you're also doing is constantly reinforcing the idea that this is not money that can be spent now. This is not money that's accessible to today. This is money that your future self is going to use. So you get them into the habit of becoming custodians and trustees of money, rather than looking at this as a consumption thing, something that we're just going to blow now. That doesn't mean, Stephen, that you don't let them use some of the money at some point, but because we all need some kind of a reward for good behavior. But I think it's about getting them gradually used to it, and then gradually allocating a bit more money, and then opening up, on the family's position. But don't do it as a surprise. That's a terrible idea.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, it's so often it's just about getting that practice, getting that experience, and the message coming from the parents. Warren, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Warren Ingram, of course, co-founder of Galileo Capital and a certified financial planner with personal finance on The Money Show.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth at Beyond the Budget 2025.
So many more conversations about money to come with you tomorrow. Aubrey Masango is, of course, next, and plenty of radio to keep you company through the evening. Where are we? Another 3 weeks until we get the budget? I think I've said that before. Good evening. It's 8 o'clock.